Good afternoon. Welcome back, and welcome back to Alma and Savet. Your GSIs returned covered in glory from the annual demography event. On Friday, we will hand back the tests and the labs, right, with a little bit of luck and a tailwind. You there? And today, we're going to turn to the Cold War, where we left last time. I regret that the last lecture on material for the lab was given. I had to rely on my vast repertoire of hand gestures because of technological difficulties which are now solved. So I invite you, if it was more confusing than usual, please send email on points that you'd like clarified, and I'll try and discuss this through BSpace. You send me questions, and I will elaborate on points that were missed. But I don't want to beat that dead horse again because we don't have that much time left. Okay, so send email if there were questions about some of the important stuff that wasn't up there. The slides for that lecture are on the course calendar, but they're under the download part for the lab itself. Right, so there's a new link there called slides, and you can get that. Send email if you have trouble with that. Okay, so we're turning now then to the period after World War II. Which period was called the Cold War. There's perhaps some debate about whether the Cold War started during World War II or immediately after, but there's not much debate that immediately after World War II, when the Germans were defeated, our good friends, the Soviets, became our mortal enemies in essentially the blink of an eye. That's the power of ideology. I think a real touchstone, a real key feature of the 20th century. Ideology plays an important role, perhaps comparable to the role of religion in the 1600s. When we talked about the Protestant Reformation and the wars of religion that swept across Europe, there's something similar about the irreconcilable differences between Protestantism and Catholicism in that period, and between capitalism and communism, or democracy and communism, however you want to phrase that. In any case, this is a new period, and one that is important for immigration, for immigrants, for immigration, and for immigration law, but also, unfortunately, a fairly confused one. Okay. The main points, I think, are these. First, that the U.S. emerges from World War II as a very changed society. It's very different from how it emerged from World War I. Isolationism, while we still had an isolationist streak, after World War I, that isolationist streak was dominant, and the League of Nations went down to defeat, the Versailles Treaty was never ratified, and all that gave Woodrow Wilson a stroke. And as a result, the U.S. remained isolationist and was grossly unprepared for World War II. After World War II, things looked very different. While the Soviet Union had never been a good friend, after World War I, the Soviet Union was weak. It could easily be excluded from the Versailles negotiations, for example. But after World War II, Russia was quite strong, or the Soviet Union, should say, was quite strong, although it had lost more soldiers and more civilians than any other state. It nonetheless ended the war with in control of a considerable amount of Eastern European territory. So it ended in a very strong position. That was very different from World War I. So all this together meant that the U.S. really couldn't ignore the Soviet Union the way it had, or at least pretended to, after World War I. So isolationism, xenophobia, while they persist ideologically, or they persist emotionally, they certainly are part of the debate. They're not dominant anymore. Instead, we see the U.S. involved in such projects as NATO, the United Nations, the World Bank, the Marshall Plan. All of these have a common thread. They're not all fully and entirely devoted to this purpose, but they all have some component of containment of communism within them, and that indeed does become a big part of the U.S. international agenda. The Cold War is a powerful political force, and we'll see that it cuts both ways. On the one hand, it feeds this isolationist fear because communism is a foreign idea, or at least it seems a foreign idea. Foreign ideas are dangerous. Foreign communists are the most dangerous of all. So in some sense, it feeds it, but at the same time, it feeds internationalism as well, because communism is a threat. There is the way the Cold War plays out, there are countries, the world is seen as full of countries on our side or on their side, and we need to constantly convince countries to be on our side. So the value of propaganda is important, and immigration laws and Jim Crow kinds of laws are not good propaganda in this period. So the domestic policy has international ramifications that it didn't really have before. That's a new kind of feature of the Cold War. The stakes are somewhat higher. But anyway, the Cold War is perhaps better seen rather than as a powerful political force, it's rather a distortion field. There's a lot of power in the Cold War, but it pushes in all kinds of different directions and makes, as we'll see, makes legislation kind of go both in lots of different and in some ways unexpected directions. Also, we'll see that, as has happened before, much of the immigration policy that is set during the Cold War doesn't actually work out quite the way it was intended. So that's perhaps the third main point. Well, okay. Outline for today is this. We'll start with a brief discussion of post-war U.S. society. The key points that I want to emphasize here are migration from the U.S. south to the north. Remember, this lecture is entitled Immigration and Migration during the Cold War. Migration is an important component. We saw some of that, mentioned some of that in both World War I and World War II, but it really picks up after World War II. And this really changes the way cities are in the U.S. Urbanization continues, but at the same time, a new trend, suburbanization, begins. It's very much a post-World War II phenomenon. Employment patterns change, and that altogether really changes very much the way cities are. Okay? Then, after we briefly talk about that, we'll spend most of our time with these three phases of the Cold War. I'm sure that other people have broken the Cold War into other numbers of phases or different phases. These are really more driven, I think, by our immigration focus rather than by the Cold War itself. But I think it works. Okay? So we'll talk first about the era of anti-communist hysteria. This is what we usually think of when we talk about the Cold War. This is the early period, right after the war, through the 50s, the McCarthy era, if you will. Lots of spy scandals and lots of fear. That gives way, perhaps in the late 50s and early 60s, to the civil rights era. Okay? Now, each of these eras, I have in the blue, a piece of legislation that is kind of emblematic of it. And so we'll spend some time with the McCarran-Walter Act of 1952 when we talk about the anti-communist hysteria. In the civil rights era, it will be the Hart-Sellers Immigration Act. This is the one that finally undoes the nationality quotas in 1924. This one upholds them. This one undoes them. And then, not today, but on Wednesday, we'll get to the Carter-Reagan era, the era of, you could say it's not exactly, under Carter you might call it the era of détente, under the Reagan era you might call it Cold War reheated. It's a more difficult era to describe in terms of Cold War because the anti-communist piece of it doesn't have the same punch as it has in earlier periods, yet it's important. There's a lot of nonsense in Central America that still has a very Cold War kind of feel to it. And of course, this is the era in which the Soviet Union finally collapses. In all these periods that we'll see, the Cold War has an effect on immigration policy. Immigration policy has an effect on the Cold War to some extent. And the whole period is, well, in a word, really complicated. So quickly, let's summarize post-war society. Population growth. This is the famous baby boom, of which your parents probably never stopped talking. It's people who are part of the baby boom think it was a very, very big deal. It starts after the war and ends perhaps, I don't know what the official end of it is, maybe 1960 or 64, something like that. But it creates a population bulge and it creates a younger population. So it has important effects. Also of importance is prosperity. In 1960, the GDP is 2.5 times what it was in 1940. Now, 1940 had already grown rather considerably since 1933, the depths of the Depression. So this is a fairly short period of time for the economy to more than double in size. The population grew as well, but not anywhere like that. A lot of growth in this era of white-collar jobs and a lot of productivity growth in manufacturing and agriculture, meaning at least in manufacturing, there will be increases in wages that go along with it. This increase in prosperity, in part, impels migration from the south to the north, another rural to urban and suburban migration. Now, the interesting issue for us here is why did it take so long? Why was there not more migration from the south earlier? In fact, there was some in earlier periods. I think we may have even asked this question after World War I. We saw between 1910 and 1940, we saw about 1.6 million migrants from the rural south to the urban north, and much of this impelled by World War I and labor demands. In 1940 to 1970, period of the same length, the numbers are much larger, 5 million moving north. And the question that raises why. I mean, first, why did it take till 1910 for this movement to start? The South is not a happy place. Certainly not a happy place for heavily indebted sharecroppers. Why did it take till 1910 for it to start, and why did it take till 1940 for it to really take off? And I don't have an answer for that. It's hard to say why something. It's hard to come up with the reason why something didn't happen. It's hard enough to say why things do happen. But one idea that has been suggested, and I think can't be dismissed out of hand, is that immigration plays a role. Before, in this earlier period, up until World War I, there's a lot of foreign immigration into American cities. It's a lot of labor competition. And as we saw reading the Bodner piece, and there was some disadvantage to migrant blacks in urban areas. They were in some ways disadvantaged in terms of at least employment networks vis-a-vis the immigrants. By 1940, immigration is much less of a force. There are many fewer immigrants. Population something instead of 14%, it's more on the order of 8 or 9% foreign-born, and so there are a lot more. There's less competition. Okay? But unfortunately, just as this migration gets underway, the industrial situation changes as well. And in the 1970s, we start to see real deindustrialization. These jobs that had served immigrants so well, these well-paying blue-collar jobs, that didn't make people rich, but at least positioned their children for entry into the middle class, were more and more scarce, harder and harder to find. Just at the same time, we also see the advent of suburbs and of many non-African Americans moving to the suburbs. Okay? So one could see this process of suburbanization as simply a natural process, that as wealth increases, demand for housing grew, and that housing demand, along with technological change in the form of automobiles, made it easier, more economical to build new and bigger houses outside of the city. The whites who had lived in the cities, having money, were able to take advantage of that, thus moved to the suburbs. You could see, to some extent, that is going on. But it's also critical to see that that's not the whole story, because at each step of the way, there are federal and state subsidies. For example, building roads. Roads are paid for not only by gasoline taxes, but also by general revenue. $1 billion is spent on roads in 1929. In 1956, the National Defense Interstate Highway System has begun, and 90% of that is paid by the federal government, and it results in 42,000 miles of roads. So federal subsidies to roads are making the suburbs cheaper, and so they're in fact subsidizing it. Roads encourage not only people to move, but they also encourage jobs to move. There's also the matter of the FHA, which grew out of the Depression, the Federal Housing Act of 1934, and it encouraged restrictive covenants that we discussed earlier. These are clauses in real estate contracts that limit the use of property to certain groups, usually Caucasian groups. The Federal Housing Administration, the Federal Act, actually encouraged these in 1934, and also institutionalized the practice of redlining. That is a process of deciding which neighborhoods were good investments or secure investment, usually the words that they used, and withholding mortgage investment from areas that were inside of the red lines, the neighborhoods that were thought to be not as secure. And those were based on race patterns. So the inner cities were less starved of mortgage capital. That made it harder for inner city residents to own houses that both raised the rent and tended to reduce the quality of the housing stock. All right. So think of this as background. This is essentially background to what's going on in the. Yes, your question. Oh, Levittown is a place called, I think it's called Tree Island. Something. It's a place in Long Island that was the first. I think it's considered the first housing development that uses real mass production techniques. It's Levitt and Sons bought thousands of acres of potato fields, and they built nearly identical houses every 60 feet. This is something that's not that uncommon now. If you drive down the freeway, you see small versions of this. But at the time, it was new. It brought the price of housing down in a similar way that mass production of automobiles brought the price of automobiles down. And they also came with restrictive covenants. They were only Caucasians were allowed to live there. These were built right after the war in the late 40s. Okay, so as I said, I want to think of this as background, that because I don't want you to have the idea that while the Cold War is playing out, society is stable in any sense. There are very big changes, very big population changes. Lots of blacks moving north. The cities are changing in character very, very significantly, and the suburbs are growing like crazy. All this is happening. While this is happening, the Cold War is playing out. So the early Cold War period, I think it's really nicely captured by this Herb Block cartoon from 1949, where you have the torch from the Statue of Liberty, and this guy with a bucket saying hysteria, and he's clearly going to put out that fire. This is a period when there are, when in the name of personal liberties, or in the name, I should say, of defending against the forces who want to destroy our personal liberties, certain people tread all over personal liberties. The causes of this hysteria are, well, perhaps I should say there are some real reasons behind this hysteria, I guess is what I want to say. In 1917, there were no communist countries at all. Right? By 1918, there was the Soviet Union. In 1949, China added 563 million communists to the world communist population. In 1949, the USSR exploded a nuclear device. And that was much earlier than anyone expected them to do. Anyone expected them to do that. And perhaps as a result of that, certainly coincident with that, were some spy scandals. Most famous among them were the Julius and Ethel Rosenberg scandal, which suggested the Manhattan Project had been penetrated by Soviet spies. Along with that, around the same time, was the Alger Hiss trial. And Alger Hiss, who was also accused of espionage and found guilty. And Hiss was very high in government. He was a personal friend of FDR's Secretary of State. He was himself a member of the Yalta delegation, and he was the Secretary General of the San Francisco Conference where the UN was founded. He's the one who personally flew the charter from San Francisco to Washington for Harry Truman's signature. So he was not a little-known person, and his suggestion that he was communist meant that perhaps the whole White House had been penetrated by communist spies. I don't know if it's a settled issue whether or not he was guilty, but in any case, there's room to see why people were frightened, say. This hysteria was certainly a good description of what was going on. Again, there were perhaps real causes. Decolonization was another process that was very much in play, and has also led to interesting and important ironies. Many countries from Asia and Africa were emerging at this time from colonial rule. And what that meant is that as their governments formed, choices were essentially being made, whether they were going to be good guys on our side or whether they were going to be communist. Countries that had trouble deciding, like Vietnam and Korea, for example, wound up in nasty wars. That's obviously a gross oversimplification, but I'm really saying that these were important decisions and that in some cases there were wars over the issue. But this was playing out. A large number of countries were forming governments. And this meant that in addition to our immigration policy, issues of equality, particularly issues of equality for minorities, became important. It was not good propaganda to have Jim Crow laws, for example, to have inequality. We have it on television. I'll talk a little more about that when we get to the civil rights phase of the Cold War. But it also meant that I shouldn't say had to, but that it was politically useful for the American government to characterize occasionally pretty nasty dictators as freedom-loving, because there was this good versus evil kind of undertone to the Cold War. If you weren't on our side, you're evil. If you were on our side, you're good. So, anyway, the House On-American Activities Committee was formed, which Harry Truman said was itself the most un-American activity. It's often confusingly stated that Joe McCarthy was a chair of this committee, but McCarthy was a senator. He sat on various committees, but not the House On-American Activities Committee. Their fame is investigating Alger Hiss. On the positive side, there is a positive side. The term Judeo-Christian comes into use in this period. Dwight Eisenhower uses it in phrases such as referring to our, quote, common Judeo-Christian heritage. And that is interesting because if we've learned anything in this class, it should be that the United States has no common religious heritage at all, and certainly not a Judeo-Christian one, whatever that means. It doesn't mean anything. It's just a word that was made up to distinguish our side from the side of our godless enemy, the communists. This is the same period in which under God, the words under God go into the Pledge of Allegiance. Internationally, the first important bit of legislation is the Dickey Act of 1948, and this is an act, the impetus for this act is, of course, that Europe is in complete disarray, and there are large numbers of people wandering around or in camps who either do not want to go home to Eastern Europe or else cannot for one reason or another. The impetus for the bill comes from the Citizens Committee for Displaced Persons, known as the CCDP, which is an umbrella group for several organizations, many of which were Jewish, and this organization the existence of it was designed to hide that. They were still worried, quite rightly, about anti-Semitism, so they did not want to